Chapter 11. The River Rises. During this big rise, these small fry craft were an intolerable nuisance. We were running chute after chute, a new world to me, and if there was a particularly cramped place in a chute, we would be pretty sure to meet a broadhorn there. And if he failed to be there, we would find him in a still worse locality, namely, the head of the chute and on shoal water. And then there'd be no end of profane cordialities exchanged. Sometimes in the big river, when we'd be feeling our way cautiously along through a fog, the deep hush would suddenly be broken by yells and a clamor of tin pans, and all in an instant a log raft would appear vaguely through the webby veil close upon us. And then we did not wait to swap knives, but snatched our engine bells out by the roots and piled on all the steam we had to scramble out of the way. One doesn't hit a rock or a solid log craft with a steamboat when one can get excused. You'd hardly believe it, but many steamboat clerks always carried a large assortment of religious tracts with them in those old departed steamboating days. Indeed they did. 20 times a day we would be cramping up around a bar while a string of these small fry rascals were drifting down into the head of the bend, way above and beyond us a couple of miles. Now a skiff would dart away from one of them and come fighting its laborious way across the desert of water. It would ease all in the shadow of our forecastle, and the panting oarsman would shout, "Give me a paper," as the skiff drifted swiftly astern. The clerk would throw out a file of New Orleans journals, and if they were picked up without comment, you might notice that now a dozen other skiffs had been drifting down upon us without saying anything. You understand, they'd been waiting to see how number one was going to fare. Number one making no comment, all the rest would bend their oars and come on now. And as fast as they came, the clerk would heave out neat bundles of religious tracts tied to shingles. The amount of hard swearing which 12 packages of religious literature will command, when impartially divided up among 12 raftsmen's crews, you have pulled a heavy skiff 2 miles on a hot day to get them, is simply incredible. As I've said, the big rise brought a whole new world under my vision. By the time the river was over its banks, we had forsaken our old paths and were hourly climbing over bars that stood 10 feet out of the water before. We were shaving stumpy shores like that at the foot of Madrid Bend, which I'd always seen avoided before. We were clattering through chutes like that of 82, where the opening at the foot was an unbroken wall of timber, till our nose was almost at the very spot. Some of these chutes were utter solitudes. The dense, untouched forest overhung both banks of the crooked little crack, and one could believe that human creatures have never intruded there before. The swinging grapevines, the grassy nooks and vistas, glimpses we swept by, the flowering creepers waving their red blossoms from the tops of dead trunks, and all the spendthrift richness of the forest foliage were wasted and thrown away there. The chutes were lovely places to steer in. They were deep, except at the head. The current was gentle. Under the points the water was absolutely dead, and the invisible banks so bluff that where the tender willow thickets projected, you could bury your boat's broadside in them as you tore along, and then you seemed fairly to fly. Behind other islands we found wretched little farms and wretcheder little log cabins. There were crazy rail fences sticking a foot or two above the water, with 1 or 2 jeans-clad, chills-racked, yellow-faced male miserables roosting on the top rail, elbows on knees, jaws in hands, grinding tobacco and discharging the results at floating chips through crevices left by lost teeth, while the rest of the family and the few farm animals were huddled together in an empty wood flat riding at her moorings close at hand. In this flat boat the family would have to cook and eat and sleep for a lesser or greater number of days, or possibly weeks. until the river should fall 2 or 3 feet and let them get back to their log cabin and their chills again. Chills being a merciful provision of an all-wise providence to enable them to take exercise without exertion. And this sort of watery camping out was a thing which these people were rather liable to be treated to a couple times a year. By the December rise out of the Ohio and the June rise out of the Mississippi. And yet these were kindly dispensations, for they at least enabled the poor things to rise from the dead now and then, look upon life when the steamboat went by. They appreciated the blessing, too, for they spread their mouths and eyes wide open and made the most of these occasions. Now what could these banished creatures find to do to keep from dying of the blues during the low water season? Once in one of these lovely island chutes, we found our course completely bridged by a great fallen tree. This will serve to show how narrow some of these chutes were. The passengers had an hour's recreation in virgin wilderness, while the boat hands chopped the bridge away. For there was no such thing as turning back, you comprehend. From Cairo to Baton Rouge, when the river is over its banks, you have no particular trouble in the night, for the 1,000-mile wall of dense forest that guards the two banks all the way is only gapped with a farm or wood yard opening at intervals, and so you can't get out of the river much easier than you could get out of a fenced lane. But from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, it's a different matter. The river is more than a mile wide and very deep, as much as 200 feet in places. Both banks for a good deal over 100 miles are shorn of their timber and bordered by continuous sugar plantations, with only here and there a scattering sapling or a row of ornamental china trees. The timber is shorn off clear to the rear of the plantations, from 2 to 4 miles. When the first frost threatens to come, the planters snatch off their crops in a hurry. When they have finished grinding the cane, they form the refuse of the stalks, which they call bagasse, into great piles and set fire to them, though in other sugar countries the bagasse is used for fuel in the furnaces of the sugar mills. Now the piles of damp bagasse burn slowly and smoke like Satan's own kitchen. An embankment 10 or 15 feet high guards both banks of the Mississippi all the way down to that lower end of the river, and this embankment is set back from the edge of the shore from 10 to perhaps 100 feet according to circumstances. Say 30 or 40 feet is a general thing. Fill that whole region with an impending gloom of smoke for 100 miles of burning bagasse piles when the river is over the banks, and turn a steamboat loose along there at midnight, and see how she will feel. And see how you will feel, too. You find yourself away out in the midst of a vague, dim sea that is shoreless, that fades out and loses itself in the murky distances. For you cannot discern the thin rib of embankment, and you are always imagining you see a straggling tree when you don't. The plantations themselves are transformed by the smoke and look like part of the sea. All through your watch you are tortured with the exquisite misery of uncertainty. You hope you're keeping in the river, but you do not know. All that you're sure about is that you're likely to be within 6 feet of the bank and destruction when you think you're a good half a mile from shore. And you are sure also that you chance suddenly to fetch up against the embankment and topple your chimneys overboard. You will have the small comfort of knowing that it is about what you were expecting to do. One of the great Vicksburg packets darted out into a sugar plantation one night at such a time and had to stay there a week. But there's no novelty about it. It had been often done before. I thought I'd finish this chapter, but I wish to add a curious thing while it's on my mind. It is only relevant in that it is connected with piloting.